Prologue, the scholar's record. They burned the last of the old histories 100 years ago. I was but a boy when the flames devoured the libraries of Varath. I remember standing in the streets, watching as entire lifetimes of knowledge curled into smoke and rose into the night. The fire swallowed everything: the songs of the elves, the craftsmanship of the dwarves, the last written names of the orcish warlords who fought and died in the sand. Gone. That is what the world wanted. That is what they demanded. The past was an infection, and it had to be purged. But I was a child, and a child does not understand why the sky darkens with the ghosts of forgotten words. I only knew that something precious had been lost. Years later, when I became a scholar, I learned the truth. The war had never ended. It had only changed. And now, as I sit in this ruined archive, one of the last to still remember, I record the story they tried to erase. I do not know if this account will survive. Perhaps the fire will find this place too. Perhaps my words will be carried into oblivion. But if there is even a chance, then I must write. Because the past is not dead, and one day it will return. The First Omen. There are many accounts of the end of the old world, but none agree on who first saw the outsiders. Some say it was the astronomers, those who spent their lives charting the slow drift of celestial bodies in the vast cold of space. They were the first to notice something wrong. The stars flickered where they should not. Entire constellations seemed to shudder, as if the universe itself had taken a breath. Telescopes strained against the void, picking up something just beyond the reach of human understanding, an absence where there should have been nothing at all. Others claim it was the mystics, the heretics, the outcasts. They felt it in their bones before the sky itself betrayed the secret. A ripple through existence, a whisper carried on the wind in no language ever spoken by man. Their visions were fractured, incomprehensible, a vast shadow looming over the world, a sound like the grinding of stone upon stone, the slow tolling of a bell that had never been struck. But no matter who first glimpsed the truth, history remembers what followed. The world was already at the brink of its own undoing when the outsiders arrived. Nations had long fallen into the same cycles that had doomed their predecessors: war, conquest, and the insatiable hunger for more. The planet itself had begun to wither beneath the weight of its masters. The rivers ran black with the waste of industry. The forests, once stretching to the edges of the known world, had been cut down to fuel the machines of progress. The air, thick with the choking remnants of burned cities and poisoned earth, carried the last breaths of entire civilizations. The strong built walls, the weak starved beyond them. The rich hoarded what remained of the old world's miracles: clean water, untarnished land, the promise of a future, while the poor fought over the scraps left behind. Technology, once a beacon of hope, had become a weapon. The great empires of man, desperate to outlast one another, turned their vast arsenals upon the world itself. There were wars for water, for oil, for the last veins of ore hidden beneath the earth. And then the sky opened. There was no sound, no warning, only silence. At first, it was barely noticeable. The stars dimmed. The moonlight took on a strange quality, something ancient and unfamiliar. And then, across the world, the heavens themselves pulsed, not in a way that could be measured or studied. Something deeper, something that gripped the marrow of every living thing and whispered, "Watch." For 3 days, the world watched. In the great cities, people gathered in the streets, heads tilted back, eyes fixed on the sky. In the wastelands, nomads and scavengers halted their endless struggles for survival to stare at the shifting heavens. Soldiers hesitated, hands frozen around the triggers of weapons built to slaughter their own kind. Even the animals sensed it. Flocks of birds took flight in great erratic swarms, their instincts screaming of something unnatural approaching. Communication systems failed. Radios crackled with static. Satellites, once mapping the surface of the world with precision, showed only an empty void. Machines that had never faltered simply stopped, as if the laws of nature had been rewritten in an instant. And on the 4th day, the voice came. It was not heard with ears, nor carried on any known frequency. It did not emerge from the mouths of prophets or the depths of machines. It simply was. A presence inside the minds of every living thing all at once. It did not ask permission to be understood. It did not require translation. We are not your gods. We are not your masters. We are not your enemy. And then silence. No warships descended from the heavens. No armies poured forth from unknown worlds to lay claim to the earth. Only those 3 sentences, lingering in the minds of all who heard them. In the great halls of power, rulers and warlords sat in silence, their hands frozen over plans of conquest and annihilation. In the trenches, soldiers who had once been ordered to kill hesitated, staring across the battlefield at men who, only moments before, had been their sworn enemies. In the streets, the riots that had once shaken the world fell quiet. For the first time in recorded history, war stopped. Not because of treaties, not because of surrender, but because no one knew what would happen next. It was a hesitation born not of hope, nor of peace, but of something deeper, fear, because mankind had spent its entire existence believing it was alone in the universe, and now that illusion was gone. The outsiders had arrived, and the world would never be the same. The gifts of the outsiders. The outsiders did not come in fire and fury. There were no grand fleets darkening the sky, no columns of war machines rolling across the land, no proclamations of dominion. They did not conquer. For days, weeks, months, they gave only silence. No further messages, no answers to the desperate voices crying into the void. The great rulers of men sent signals, begging for an audience. Scientists pored over the few words spoken, searching for hidden meaning. Priests and zealots fell to their knees, some weeping for salvation, others screaming of the deceiver. And yet, the outsiders did not answer. Then, without warning, they simply appeared. Not in the great cities, not in the war rooms of kings, not in the temples where their names were already being carved into stone, but in the quiet places. A shepherd tending his flock in the highlands saw one first, a shape at the edge of the mist, taller than any man, watching. A child, lost in the ruins of a broken city, stumbled upon a figure standing amid the wreckage. It did not move as she approached. It did not strike. It only watched. A scholar, alone in the last surviving library of a fallen empire, looked up from his dusty tomes and found a presence seated across from him, waiting. The outsiders did not arrive. They had always been here. Their forms were unknowable, shifting, ethereal, existing at the edge of perception. To some, they were cloaked in flowing robes of mist. To others, they shimmered like figures of living glass, reflecting the world in impossible ways. Their eyes were voids, black, endless, without iris or pupil, as if gazing into them was staring into a place where time had never begun. And they did not speak. No words passed their unseen mouths, no gestures, no sound. They only watched. The world's reaction was as varied as mankind itself. Some fell to their knees in reverence, calling them angels. Others saw them as harbingers of doom. The first bullets were fired within the week. A soldier, trembling from years of war, saw something shift in the darkness beyond his trench. He did not hesitate. The crack of gunfire shattered the silence. The bullet passed through the outsider. It did not fall. It did not bleed. It did not react. It only turned its empty gaze upon the man who had fired, and the soldier collapsed, screaming in terror. The first attempts at containment followed soon after. The rulers of men, crippled by their own paranoia, saw the outsiders not as saviors, not as gods, but as a threat. They sent their armies, gas, fire, electricity. Weapons designed for war, for mass slaughter, were unleashed upon the outsiders. Nothing worked. The outsiders did not retaliate. They did not defend themselves. They simply left to observe from their place in the sky, and in their place they left gifts. The price of knowledge. The first of the outsiders' gifts appeared without warning. A sphere. Perfect, smooth, featureless, placed in the heart of the wasteland where once a great city had stood. It did not hum with power, nor glow with unnatural light. It simply was. At first, no one dared approach. Soldiers encircled it, weapons drawn, expecting an enemy to emerge from within. Scientists gathered, their instruments at the ready, desperate to measure what could not be understood. Religious zealots wept at its base, declaring it the ark of a new age. Then, the bravest, or perhaps the most desperate, stepped forward. A single touch, and the world changed. It did not speak, not in the way the outsiders had before, but knowledge flooded into the minds of those who touched it, a gift given in silence, without price, without demand. It was cure, a sickness, ancient and merciless, one that had plagued mankind since the dawn of civilization, was erased in an instant. The afflictions of the body, diseases that had stolen lives for generations, vanished without a trace. The blind opened their eyes and saw. The crippled rose from their beds and walked. The hospitals, once overflowing with the dying, stood eerily silent as the ill became whole once more. The priests declared it a miracle. The rulers of men looked upon this gift with fear. For the first time in history, death itself had been challenged, and the outsiders remained silent. Then, a second sphere appeared. This time, the gift was power, a limitless energy source, one that burned without fuel, that radiated without waste, that provided warmth and light without cost. The great engines of industry, once driven by the destruction of the earth, ground to a halt as this new power spread across nations. No more need for coal, for oil, for the poisons that had blackened the skies. Cities were reborn. Farmlands, long abandoned to the creeping desert, flourished under machines that no longer needed the blood of the earth to function. For the first time in history, war over resources became meaningless. What need was there to fight when there was enough? What reason was there to hoard when all could share in abundance? For a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, humanity hesitated. Peace was not declared, not formally. No treaties were signed, no oaths were taken. But the violence slowed. The world, long broken by its own hand, began to heal. And then, the third gift arrived. But this was no machine, no silent offering of knowledge or energy. This was something alive. The children of the outsiders. The third gift was not given. It was born. It began as a whisper, a rumor passed from village to village, from scholar to scribe. At first, no one believed it. The miracles of the outsiders had already reshaped the world. What more could they offer? Then the first children came into the world. At first, they were no different from any other. Small, fragile, cradled in the arms of mothers and fathers who saw only the future in their eyes. But they did not sicken. The fevers that took others did not touch them. The plagues that had once wiped out whole bloodlines passed them by. They grew faster. By the age of 5, they were taller than their peers. By 10, they were stronger. By 20, they were untouched by time, their youth lingering long past when it should have faded. And then, the true changes revealed themselves. A boy in the West did not bleed when he was cut. His wounds closed within moments, the flesh knitting itself back together as if the injury had never been. A girl in the South swam beneath the sea for hours, her lungs drawing breath where none should have been possible. A farmer's son in the frozen North walked barefoot through a blizzard and did not shiver. The cold did not bite him. The snow did not settle upon his skin. And for the first time in history, humanity was no longer alone in its own reflection. The world gave them names. The elves with their unnaturally sharp eyes, their hands delicate yet precise, their lifespans stretching impossibly long. The dwarves, their bodies built like stone, their endurance unmatched, their skill with craft and machine beyond anything seen before. The orcs, their blood running hotter than any humans, their bodies larger, their strength legendary. The merfolk, who thrived beneath the waves, their lungs drawing both air and sea as if neither were foreign. The lizard folk, cold-blooded, calculating, their senses attuned to things no human could perceive. The goblins and gnomes, small and sharp, their minds twisting through the complexities of invention and discovery with effortless brilliance. They were humanity's children. And at first, they were loved. The outsiders gave no explanation. They did not tell mankind why this had happened, whether it was a gift or a necessity. But the world rejoiced. For the first time in history, the future seemed brighter. A golden age had begun, and it would not last. The seeds of fear. It did not happen all at once. Fear is a patient thing. The first whisper came from a scholar, an old man who had spent his life mapping the course of history. They are stronger than us. The second came from a merchant, watching his dwarven apprentices forge steel with hands that never tired. What happens when they no longer need us? The third came from a king, looking down upon his court, seeing his elven advisor stand tall and unbent by time. They will outlive us all. The whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs turned to laws, and the golden age began to crack. At first the changes were subtle, small precautions, the rulers called them, guidelines for the safety of all. The hybrids were different after all. They required special considerations, special communities where they could grow and thrive away from the fragility of human cities, separate systems tailored for their needs, for their own good. It was not exile. It was organization. It was not oppression. It was protection. And the people believed it, for a time. But time moves swiftly in the minds of men. And when the first rumors spread, whispers of hybrids living longer, growing stronger, becoming something other, fear took root. The laws changed. The precautions became restrictions. A dwarven blacksmith, once celebrated for his craft, was told he could no longer sell his wares to humans. A merfolk merchant was forbidden from setting foot in the markets of the inner cities. An elven woman, accused of using her unnatural beauty to seduce a nobleman, was dragged from her home in the dead of night. The whispers grew louder. They are not like us. They are not us. And so the walls were built. The first hybrid enclaves were created under the guise of fairness, separate districts, separate businesses, separate homes. What had once been a choice became an expectation, and when expectations were not met, they became laws. And when laws were broken, the first blood was spilled. A dwarven engineer caught selling his machines outside the enclave was found dead in the streets. A goblin child accused of theft was hung from a city gate as a warning to others. An orc, strong and proud, dared to defy a decree and was dragged before a crowd, forced to kneel before a king who had once called him brother. The execution was swift. The message was clear. Fear had won. The hybrids, once celebrated, were now contained. But containment was not enough. Not for the rulers who had seen what they could do. Not for the scholars who had mapped their potential. Not for the kings who feared a future where humanity was no longer the master of its own world. And so in secret, the next stage began. A new law was written, one that would not be spoken aloud, one that would never be declared before the people, but one that would change history forever. The first betrayal. The first sterilizations were done quietly. Hybrids who sought medical care for routine illnesses were given treatments that left them barren, their futures stolen without their knowledge. Those who wished to marry outside their kind were denied, told that the bloodlines must remain pure. And when the first experiments began, when the rulers of men sought to undo what the outsiders had left behind, the true horror began. The war had not started yet, not in the open, but in the darkness, behind locked doors, in rooms where no one dared to speak the truth aloud. It had already begun. For years, the hybrids endured. They endured as the walls rose higher, as the cities that once welcomed them became fortresses built to keep them out. They endured as the laws tightened, as the promises of equality were reduced to whispers of a time long past. But endurance is not the same as acceptance, and when the first massacre came, they stopped enduring. The first massacre. For years, the hybrids endured. They endured as the walls rose higher, as the cities that once welcomed them became fortresses built to keep them out. They endured as the laws tightened, as the promises of equality were reduced to whispers of a time long past. But endurance is not the same as acceptance, and when the first massacre came, they stopped enduring. The dwarven enclave of Red Hollow had stood for generations, a thriving settlement on the outskirts of Varn, one of the great industrial cities of men. Its people were craftsmen, builders, inventors, tinkers of machines that no human could replicate. Though the laws forbade them from trading freely, they survived. Then the fires came. The official decree claimed it was an accident, a tragic blaze that had spread too quickly for the city guard to contain. But those who found the bodies knew the truth. There was no smoke in their lungs. They had burned after they were already dead. Children, elders, families, all slaughtered before the flames consumed the evidence. The city officials called for mourning. They wept in public squares, offered condolences to the hybrid communities, and promised justice. No arrests were made, no trials were held, no human was punished, and the hybrids knew then what they had always feared in the deepest parts of their souls. The world would never allow them to belong. It was an orc who struck first. His name has been lost to time, his face forgotten by history, but his actions remain eternal. The magistrate of Varn stood before the council, delivering a speech, a meaningless apology wrapped in the guise of authority. His words were careful, measured, promises of reform, of new protections, of laws that would ensure such a tragedy never happened again. He did not see the figure moving through the crowd. He did not see the flash of steel, and when the blade struck, when it slid into his chest and stole the breath from his lungs, the world stopped. For the first time, the hybrids did not endure. They fought back. The Hybrid War. The war did not begin as wars of old had begun. There were no banners raised, no armies marching in formation, no declarations of conquest. It began with blood. It began in the streets of Varn, where dwarves, elves, and orcs tore through the city guard with desperation sharpened into steel. It spread to the slums, where goblins and gnomes set fire to the homes of those who had enslaved them. Across the cities, the enclaves rose. Elves who had spent their lives in silence emerged from the shadows, their hands gripping the weapons they had once used to carve beauty from the world. Dwarves, the builders, the makers, turned their tools into instruments of war. Orcs, long accused of being violent by nature, became exactly what the world had feared them to be. The first rebellion was not organized, it was not planned, nor led by a single banner. It was an eruption, 1,000 voices screaming at once, a people who had been beaten for too long finally daring to strike back. And the world answered, not with mercy, not with understanding, but with war. The first battles were small. Skirmishes fought in the alleys of cities that had once prided themselves on their civility. Patrols of city guards torn apart in the dead of night. Watchtowers burned to the ground. Merchants who had refused to trade with hybrids found their shops in ruins, their wealth scattered to the wind. But war is not built on battles of vengeance, and the rulers of men knew how to fight one far better than the hybrids did. It was not long before the first execution orders were signed. Kill all hybrids on sight. There were no arrests, no trials, no mercy. Soldiers marched into the enclaves with fire and steel, their orders clear, their purpose absolute. Entire districts were emptied. Bodies lined the streets, left to rot as warnings to those who might resist. The merfolk were driven from the waters, their homes poisoned, their rivers dammed to choke them of life. The dwarves fled underground, carving deep into the earth where human armies could not follow. The elves vanished into the forests, their vengeance swift and silent, their daggers finding the throats of those who had betrayed them. The orcs did not run, they fought. The first true battle of the war was fought in the fields of Carthus, where an army of human soldiers, 20,000 strong, marched upon an orc settlement that had refused to surrender. They expected an easy victory. What they found was slaughter. The orcs had no siege engines, no cavalry, no war machines of steel and fire. They had themselves. When the dust settled, the field was silent. Of the 20,000 soldiers sent to Carthus, only a few hundred returned. The war had begun, and it would not end until the world was bathed in blood. The final betrayal. No one knows how many years the war lasted. Some say it was a decade. Others claim it stretched beyond a century, that the conflict was passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, until it became all the world had ever known. The truth does not matter, only the suffering remains. The humans waged war with discipline, with tactics honed over generations of conquest. Their armies were vast, their weapons relentless. They built walls that stretched to the heavens, forged weapons from the bones of the world itself, turned entire cities into fortresses of stone and steel. The hybrids fought with desperation. They did not have the numbers, nor the resources, nor the wealth of the great kingdoms, but they had fury. The elves became assassins, striking from the shadows, their arrows finding the hearts of kings before slipping into the darkness once more. The dwarves built great machines of war, weapons that burned hotter and struck harder than anything the world had seen before. The merfolk disappeared beneath the waves, their vengeance swift, their daggers cutting the throats of sailors who dared to sail too close. The orcs were fire and blood. They burned the fields of their enemies, left nothing but ruin in their wake. They fought not for land, not for conquest, but for survival itself. And yet, for all their might, for all their victories, for all their relentless defiance, the hybrids were losing. The human kingdoms did not stop. They would not stop. And when the war reached its peak, when it seemed that no victory, no battle, no act of defiance could turn the tide, the first nuclear bomb was dropped. Not upon a human city, not upon a kingdom of men, but upon a hybrid sanctuary, a place called Lenstra, a place that had harbored the tired, the wounded, the lost, a place that had tried to escape the war, to build a future beyond the cycle of bloodshed, a place that no longer exists. In an instant, it was gone. The sky burned with a fire that never truly faded, and in the heart of the wasteland, where Lenstra once stood, nothing grows, nothing lives. The war was over, not because peace had been won, but because there was no one left to fight. The fall of civilization. The war had ended, but the blood had not yet dried. The cities of men still stood, though many bore the scars of battle. Walls scorched by fire, streets paved with the bones of the fallen, ruins left where once there had been monuments to the so-called greatness of humankind. But the victors did not celebrate. The silence that followed was not peace. It was something else, something colder, something heavier. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next scream, the next strike, the next war. But no war came. Because there was nothing left to conquer, the hybrids were gone. Some had fled into exile, retreating to the deep places of the world where no human army could follow. Some had sealed themselves behind stone and steel, choosing to vanish rather than kneel. And some had simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their names fading from history like whispers lost to the wind. But humanity was not satisfied with exile. Exile meant they could return. Exile meant they could survive. And survival was not what humanity wanted. It wanted erasure. And so, when the war had ended, the true betrayal began. The great cities gathered their scholars, their scientists, their kings and rulers, and together they forged a final decree, one not spoken aloud, one never written in the pages of history. The final solution. It began with the books, the old records, the histories, the songs and stories of the hybrids, all taken, all burned. In the great libraries, the knowledge of the past was reduced to ash. The cities of men, once proud of their learning, turned upon their own scholars, demanding that no mention be made of what had come before. The elves had never existed, they said. The dwarves were myths, tales spun from the minds of madmen. The orcs were monsters of legend, nothing more. The merfolk had always been fantasies, the goblins nothing but stories to frighten children. The war itself was rewritten. No longer was it a genocide. No longer was it a crime against the world itself. It was a victory, a triumph of humankind over the unnatural, and in time, the world believed it. The children born after the war were raised in ignorance, taught that there had never been a war, that the outsiders had never come, that the gifts of the past had always belonged to mankind alone. The ruins of hybrid cities were left to crumble, their names forbidden, their stones claimed by time. The last of the hybrids who remained among men, those who had hidden their lineage, those who had survived in silence, were hunted. Not by armies, not by fire and steel, but by the slow, grinding weight of civilization itself. They could not own land. They could not bear children. They could not speak of who they were. And when they were gone, when the last of them had been erased either by time or by blade, the world moved on. Or so humanity thought. Because the war had never ended, it had only changed. The outsiders' final decision. They had been watching. From the moment they had arrived, from the moment they had gifted humanity with knowledge, with power, with life itself. They had watched. They had seen the rise of hope. They had seen the promise of something better. And then they had seen it all fall to ruin. The humans had been given everything, and they had chosen destruction. It was not the war that sealed humanity's fate. It was the silence that followed. Because the outsiders had not intervened. They had watched as the cities burned, as the hybrids fell, as the world tore itself apart, and they had waited. Perhaps they had hoped. Perhaps they had believed that, even after everything, mankind could still change. But when the fires died, when the swords were lowered, when the war had ended and the last of the hybrids had been erased, the outsiders knew the truth. Humanity was not ready, and so they left, not in ships, not in grand displays of power. One by one, they vanished, just as they had appeared. They took their final gift with them, the limitless energy, the miracle of technology, the knowledge that could have saved the world. They left the cities in darkness. They left the machines to rust. They left humanity to its own ruin. And in their wake, the world fell apart. The great cities crumbled, unable to sustain themselves without the power they had stolen. The machines of industry fell silent, their gears grinding to a halt as the last remnants of the outsiders' gifts withered away. The world was forgotten. Civilization collapsed. And from the ashes, a new age began. An age of dust. An age of ruin. An age where the ghosts of the past still walked the earth, their names whispered in secret, their legends spoken only in hushed tones. The war had never ended. It had only changed. And something else had been watching. Something that had waited before. Something that would wait again. The story begins. The death of the hybrids did not bring peace. There was no golden age awaiting mankind, no triumphant march into prosperity. The war had been won, but the victory was hollow. The world had bled itself dry, and now there was nothing left to fight over. The cities, once grand and towering, began to wither. The great industrial districts, which had once been powered by the limitless energy of the outsiders' gifts, stood silent. The factories, the refineries, the machines that had built an empire from the bones of the old world, dead. The rulers of men so quick to erase history had not foreseen what came next. Without the outsiders' energy, the world plunged into darkness. The rich hoarded what little remained, retreating behind steel walls, their palaces lit by the last scraps of stolen power. Outside their gates, the common people suffered. The machines of progress, once worshipped as the pinnacle of human achievement, lay abandoned in the streets. Steam engines sat rusting in forgotten rail yards. The great airships that had once crossed the skies like floating citadels drifted into silence, falling from the heavens like dying gods. There were no wars, because there were no armies left to fight them. The nations that had once ruled with fire and steel crumbled under the weight of their own excess. The last human empire, its name now lost to time, made one final attempt to reclaim what had been lost. A final march into the wastelands, seeking the remnants of the outsiders' technology, hoping to salvage enough power to restore what had been broken. They never returned. The deserts swallowed them, and with them, the last remnants of the old world. The age of steel and fire had ended, and in its place, only dust remained, and from the dust, a new story would rise.
The Age of Rebirth. For generations, the hybrids had been little more than whispers in the dark, shadows slipping between the cracks of a broken world. Their names were erased, their histories burned, their presence unwelcome in the ruins of a civilization that had once cast them out. And so they hid, in the deep places where the roots of the world twisted through forgotten stone, in the high peaks where the winds howled secrets only the mountains could hear, in the endless wastes where the bones of cities lay buried beneath shifting sands. They endured. Time moved slowly in exile, measured not in years but in the steady erosion of memory. Humanity, left to its own ruin, collapsed further into decay. The great cities crumbled. The old empires faded into dust. What remained of mankind wandered in the husks of their ancestors' ambition, scraping out a life in the hollow shell of a world they no longer ruled. And the hybrids watched, not with anger, nor with hatred, but with patience, because the world was changing. The echoes of the old war had faded into silence. The fears that had once driven humanity to slaughter were now distant, their weight too heavy for the weak shoulders of a people struggling just to survive. The hybrids knew the lessons of the past. They had seen the cycle of destruction, the hunger for control, the madness of power. But time was a river, and all things flowed forward. And as the first green shoots pushed through the cracked stone of the fallen world, so too did the first steps of the forgotten. They did not come as conquerors, they did not come as saviors, they came as those who had once belonged, and it was time to belong again. A return to the light. The first to emerge were the wanderers. They walked the roads once trod by their ancestors, passing through the broken ribs of cities long dead, where rusted towers stretched toward an empty sky. They moved through the old battlefields, where the bones of the past lay buried beneath the soil, their nameless graves feeding the new forests that swallowed the scars of war. They did not come in numbers, not at first. A lone elf seen trading in a human settlement, a dwarven smith hammering steel in the ruins of a long-forgotten forge, an orc mercenary offering his strength to protect the weak instead of destroy them, a merfolk child spotted in the rivers, laughing in waters their kind had once been hunted from. They did not hide, and the world did not turn them away. Not this time. Because time had stripped humanity of its arrogance. The people left in the ruins had no kings, no armies, no empire to enforce the old laws. They had only survival, and in the face of hunger and cold, in the endless silence of a dying world, the differences that had once divided them no longer seemed to matter. At first, there was hesitation. Eyes watched from doorways, hands lingered on the hilts of old knives. But the hybrids did not come with war in their hearts. They came with skills, with knowledge, with the will to build instead of destroy. The elves still knew the ways of the forests, how to make barren land bloom and broken things whole again. The dwarves remembered the craft of stone and steel, reforging what had once been lost. The orcs, long feared for their strength, stood as walls against the chaos of the wilds, protectors instead of monsters. And for the first time in centuries, there was no fear in their presence. There was only need. And so, the world shifted. The first settlements of the New Age were not kingdoms, nor great cities built on the bones of conquest. They were small things, villages at the edges of the wild, hamlets nestled in the hollows of the earth, where human and hybrid lived not as master and outcast, but as neighbors. No banners flew, no proclamations were made. But a new era had begun, the age of rebirth. A world reforged. The rivers ran clean again. The forests, once stripped bare by human greed, stretched tall and strong, their roots digging deep into a land that had been given time to heal. The ruins of the old world still stood, their broken towers casting long shadows over the earth, but they were no longer monuments to failure. They were lessons. The people of this new age did not seek to reclaim the empires of old. They did not rebuild the cities as they once were, nor did they seek to harness the power that had led their ancestors to ruin. The world had taught them the cost of excess, the folly of conquest, the weight of greed. Instead, they built something new. The villages grew, not in dominance, but in harmony. They rose from the land instead of being carved into it, shaped by the hands of those who understood its ways. Human and hybrid side by side, shared what they knew, passing their knowledge as freely as they shared their harvests. The elves taught the humans how to listen to the land, to read the signs in the wind, to grow without taking too much. The dwarves taught them how to shape metal without greed, how to build with patience, how to forge weapons meant to protect, not to conquer. The orcs, once feared for their strength, became the guardians of this fragile peace, not as rulers, but as warriors who fought only when there was no other choice.
The merfolk returned to the seas, guiding the fishermen away from waters that had once been poisoned by industry. The goblins and gnomes, minds as sharp as ever, turned their craft to invention, their machines no longer built for war, but for life. And humanity for all its sins, for all its past mistakes, learned.
They learned to live not as masters of the world, but as its keepers. They learned that survival was not about dominion, but about balance. For the first time in history, the world was not divided by race, by fear, by the hunger for power. For the first time, the world was whole. And in the quiet of the new dawn, as the sun rose over lands no longer scorched by war, the outsiders watched from the void beyond the stars. They had waited, and now at last they saw what they had hoped for, not the return of what had been lost, but the birth of something greater.